This video is about infrastructure as a factor that influences growth and development. So, what is infrastructure? Infrastructure is the basic systems and services such as transport, roads, railways, that sort of thing, and power supplies that a household or firm uses in order to work effectively. Transportation, broadband internet, gas, sewerage, clean running water, electricity are all examples of infrastructure. Soft infrastructure also includes services such as NHS healthcare and state education. Most infrastructure networks require high-cost investments, but are vital to a country's economic growth and economic development prospects. So although these projects are expensive, you could argue that they need to be undertaken even if there are substantial short-run opportunity costs. Capital spending on infrastructure may be funded publicly by the state, privately through private sector investment, or a combination of the two, which is called a public-private partnership. An example of a public-private partnership is the Private Finance Initiative. So let's take an example of a PFI project. A while back, the state decided that it needed a new children's hospital in Liverpool. So they approached a construction company to build the hospital for the state. So why did they do this? Wouldn't it have just made sense for the state to have borrowed the money and built the hospital itself and employed some construction workers? Well, the problem of directly providing the infrastructure itself would have been a one-time increase in the national debt. Let's imagine that it costs £20 million to build this brand new hospital. That would have created an immediate increase in the UK government's national debt because the UK government would have been borrowing the money. So that might have spooked the bond markets, if not that one transaction, but heavy programs of public sector expenditure provided by issuing debt. It might prompt the bond market into asking for higher rates of interest on government debt due to an increased perceived risk of a sovereign default. So the way around this is that you approach a private company, they borrow the £20 million, they employ the workers, they get the hospital built. So you might ask yourself, well, why would they do that? Why would a private company build a hospital with its own money? Unless they were a charity, I guess. The answer is that there's some profit in it. Under a PFI deal, the state promises to pay the company that built the new school or hospital a fixed amount of money every year in return for using the infrastructure that the private company created. So in this case, the state might agree to pay the construction company £3 million every year in return for allowing the NHS to use this Alder Hey hospital that they built. Now, over 20 years, that comes to £60 million. So the construction company will receive £60 million over the duration of a 20-year contract. 20 times 3 million a year equals 60 million. Remember that the cost of building the hospital was only 20 million. So the construction company clears £40 million over the duration of the project. And those figures are not an exaggeration. In practice, PFI has been very bad value for money for the taxpayer. But politicians love it because it's a way of creating shiny new infrastructure without having an immediate impact on the fiscal deficit or national debt. So let's look at the impacts that infrastructure spending has on productivity. It could be argued that high quality infrastructure increases a country's productivity. Now remember here, productivity is output per worker, so that's what we're referring to. So we're going to construct a logic chain with the goal of trying to prove that improving infrastructure leads to an increase in output per worker. Yeah, productivity, output per worker, not the same as production, which is total output. So what we're looking at here one more time is spending on infrastructure can increase output per worker. It can increase productivity. So another kind of dialer cliche that the examiners will recognise and reward is that developing countries suffer from low productivity, partially because their infrastructure isn't up to scratch. And an example you could use is Nigeria. The Nigerian government's national grid for the supply and distribution of energy, electricity in particular, is unreliable. As a result of that unreliability, power cuts are fairly common in Nigeria. During a power cut, factory production will be halted. If the factory is using machinery that's powered by electricity, when the power goes off, the machines stop, production stops. So total output will fall, the factory's lying idle during the power cut. Obviously the number of people employed in the factory stays the same whilst the power's off for a day, for an hour or two, maybe, hopefully. So during that period, output per worker will fall. So next we'll turn our attention to the impacts that infrastructure has on private sector efficiency and costs. So low productivity created by poor infrastructure makes businesses inefficient. If output per worker drops, the same workforce will produce less output. This will increase unit labour costs. Unit labour costs being the wage cost of producing a unit of output. Logically speaking, if output falls relative to the total amount spent on wages, unit labour costs must rise. So you can see at the bottom of the screen there, unit labour cost is equal to the wage paid to each worker divided by productivity. So if output per worker drops, the denominator decreases, and that will increase unit labour costs. So inefficient firms operating with high unit labour costs, because their productivity is low, because they're having to use lousy infrastructure, they'll suffer from high costs. To make a profit, you've got to charge higher prices if your costs are higher than they should be because of poor productivity that's caused by an infrastructure problem. So let's look at some numbers. Let's imagine a factory that's employing 1,000 workers, and those 1,000 workers produce in total 1 million widgets every year. Each worker's paid a salary of £10,000 a year. That's the wage that each worker gets. So what's the unit labour cost of each widget produced? So production is 1,000 widgets, productivity is 1,000 widgets divided by the number of workers. So each worker produces 1,000 widgets. So the unit labour cost is the wage paid to each worker divided by each worker's output. So 10,000 divided by 1,000 equals £10 per widget. Okay, so moving on. So the year after a new manager is appointed, she improves the production line so that there are fewer stoppages. Maybe the government helps as well by making electricity more reliable. As a result of the reduction in stoppages, output goes up by 10%. What happens? Well, the new level of production is 1,100,000. You've not employed any extra workers to get that increase in output because it's come about as a result of an improvement in efficiency. So productivity goes up from 1,000 to 1,100 widgets per worker per year. So you're still paying the workers £10,000 each, but each worker's now producing 1,100 widgets rather than 1,000 widgets. So that reduces the unit labour cost from £10 to £9.09. Now the great benefit there is that if you can reduce your unit labour costs, you can you could decide to just keep your price the same, enjoy a fatter profit margin, or if you were operating in a more competitive market, what you might choose to do is to cut your price in the hope that you're going to experience an increase in your sales volume by being able to undercut one of your competitors. And because you've reduced your unit costs, the price cut won't compromise your profit margin. Okay, let's look at this one then. So the impacts of infrastructure on private sector investment. Public sector capital expenditure on infrastructure lowers the cost of doing business by increasing productivity. For example, if the state improves transport infrastructure, there'll be less congestion and fewer delays. If there's less time wasted, firms will be able to raise production without having to hire additional staff. Better hospitals will mean fewer days missed due to ill health. Again, what that means is that output increases without the need to hire additional staff, so productivity goes up. Increases in productivity raise profits because they reduce unit labour costs. Higher profits enable firms to purchase more capital, so greater public sector investment can indirectly lead to more private sector investment. So what have I on the screen there? So we've got a congested central London. What have I said? Poor infrastructure reduces the profitability of private sector capital expenditure. If infrastructure was improved, what would happen to the position of the marginal efficiency of capital curve? You might just want to pause here. If you've forgotten what the marginal efficiency of capital is, shame on you. You need to look back now at your theme 2 notes on the determinants of investment. So do that now. Okay, so hopefully you've done that. So basically the curve, the MEC curve, will shift out to the right because lower costs will increase the anticipated rate of return expected from any given private capital expenditure project. So what will happen? Well, at any given rate of interest, there'll be more investment taking place if the MEC curve has shifted to the right. So what we're basically saying here in summary is that if the state gets infrastructure right, it can increase the profitability of private sector investment, and that private sector investment can help the economy to grow. So yeah, one more time, what we're saying here is that infrastructure is really important. Infrastructure is used by business. If you improve it, businesses can operate more efficiently. They can achieve higher levels of productivity and lower costs. This will increase the profitability of them investing. They will react to better infrastructure, lower costs by doing exactly that. And the increase in private sector investment will help the economy to grow and become more internationally competitive. Okay, so what's the role of infrastructure in attracting inward FDI? So as we know, developing countries suffer from savings gaps. This is because due to low per capita incomes, most people in developing countries are too poor to save. So a shortage of loanable funds reduces domestic investment. And if you are a bit unsure on that, you need to look back on the material we did on the Harrod-Domar model. But private sector investment is required to industrialise. Without industrialisation, a developing country will struggle to achieve the growth needed to lift per capita incomes. They'll be stuck with primary product dependency. They need to industrialize, but to industrialize they need investment, and if that investment doesn't happen, then the economy just gets stuck with a low level of economic development. The solution to the savings gap is to attract foreign direct investment. FDI is an investment in a business in one country by another business based in a different country. Nigeria can industrialize by inviting foreign-owned multinationals to build factories in Nigeria. In today's globalized world, capital is internationally mobile. Multinationals will invest wherever rates of return are highest. In other words, they'll invest where pound for pound or dollar for dollar they can make the most profit. High quality public infrastructure can lift the profitability of private sector investment, and in doing so increase the likelihood of experiencing inward FDI. So again, we've got a screen there of a Coca-Cola bottling plant. So the profitability of this bottling plant will in part depend upon whether the Nigerian government is capable of supplying Coca-Cola Nigeria with a reliable supply of electricity. Power cuts will reduce the profitability of investing in machinery that is powered by electricity. So if you want to attract inward FDI, you need to get your infrastructure right. They won't come unless you get basic infrastructure in place that works, because without the infrastructure, the profitability of investing in your country will be too low. There'll be other places that are more desirable. So what are the benefits of infrastructure spending? Infrastructure spending increases aggregate demand. So let's go through the logic chain of this. Public sector capital expenditure will increase the government spending component of aggregate demand. So if the government spends money on building a new road, whatever they spend on that road will be included within the G component of aggregate demand. In the case of an infrastructure investment financed by a private firm via PFI, the spending will increase the I component of aggregate demand because it's private sector investment that's taking place. So it doesn't really matter how infrastructure is financed. If it's financed by the state, G will increase. If it's financed via private firms, I will increase. So it doesn't really matter how it's financed, AD will increase. Keynesians look for so-called shovel-ready infrastructure projects. So these are investments that can be undertaken very quickly, and Keynesians like them because they think it's a very quick way of reducing unemployment. So, if you can start building a new railway line quickly, it's ready to go. That will create jobs for the people that are going to lay the rails and make the steel for the rails, etc. So you'd say it's shovel ready, it's ready to go. When consumer confidence is low during a recession, Keynesians prefer infrastructure spending to tax cuts as a way of delivering a fiscal stimulus. This is because, unlike tax cuts that can be saved by households, government spending on infrastructure immediately lifts aggregate demand and enters a circular flow of income. So in other words, you might want to inject £50 billion worth of spending into the economy. If you try to inject it through a tax cut, households, if they're spooked out and worried about their jobs, might choose to save most of the tax cut that you've given them. And if you're a Keynesian, that's terrible. Because you believe that aggregate demand is the most important factor that determines output and employment. Much better instead to inject the spending directly into the economy by actually building something. As you know, infrastructure spending increases long run aggregate supply. Why do I say that? Well, from theme 2, you know already that long run aggregate supply is dependent on two things. Those two things being the quantity and quality of a country's factors of production. Infrastructure investment raises the productivity of labour. By improving the quality of a nation's labour, infrastructure spending has the potential to increase long-run aggregate supply. If output per worker increases, the nation's full employment output level, that's the output level where the long-run aggregate supply curve becomes perfectly price inelastic, will increase because the same number of workers will now be able to produce more in total if each worker can produce more. The increase in productivity created by investing in infrastructure will also shift the economy's PPF to the right. So in the picture there we've got Chinese maglev trains. These are trains that don't have wheels. They're suspended in air by magnetism, and they can travel unbelievably fast speeds, like 1,000 kilometers an hour. So why is that? What's the link to long run aggregate supply? Well, I guess, if people's commutes are shorter, by the time they get to work, they're less tired, so they might work more effectively. Also, I guess if their commutes are shorter, they might actually end up perhaps maybe working more hours because they're not spending so much time on a train. Either way, if productivity goes up, that will increase long run aggregate supply. I think there's something in this, to be honest. If you look at countries that have high levels of labour productivity, these countries also tend to have excellent infrastructure. So those of you that have travelled to Germany have probably seen that at first hand. Excellent schools, excellent transportation systems, really fast, super reliable broadband. Everything works, rather than the UK's infrastructure, which is still mostly Victorian and crumbling and unreliable and slow and overcrowded. So this makes, you can understand then that investing in the UK isn't nearly as profitable as investing in other countries that have better infrastructure. The cost of doing business in the UK is higher than it should be because our infrastructure isn't up to speed. So then, infrastructure spending has the potential to cause non-inflationary long-run economic growth. Why? Well, remember, aggregate demand will increase because either G or I will increase. And because infrastructure spending is going to increase productivity, the same number of workers will now be able to produce more in total, which will increase the productive capacity of the economy, shifting the long-run AS curve to the right. Infrastructure spending can also create positive multiplier effects. Remember, this is another topic from theme 2. The multiplier describes how an initial injection of spending into the economy can create a final increase in both aggregate demand and real GDP that is many times higher than the value of the initial injection. So, how is this? Well, obviously the infrastructure spending creates the initial injection into the circular flow. As I say again, the multiplier effect, it describes how an initial injection of spending can lead to a final increase in both AD and GDP that is many times higher than the value of the initial injection. What causes the multiplier effect? Well, to understand that, you need to appreciate that one man's expenditure is another man's income. In other words, the final increase in GDP is greater than the initial injection because the injection's respent many, many times. For example, if the government spends £50 billion on employing workers to build HS2, most of these new wages will be used to buy consumer goods. The government will need to employ people to build HS2, so those people will come off the dole queue, they'll get wages, and they'll spend most of those wages. That will create extra demand for consumer goods. So the increase in the output of consumer goods will create a second round increase in GDP. But to increase the output of consumer goods, firms in those industries will also have to take on staff from the dole queue. So those people will also have new wages to spend. So they might go and spend their money on something else. Well, they will do. And that will create a third round increase in GDP. And this is the positive multiplier effect. So a true story that I think I've mentioned before, that in an effort to kickstart aggregate demand and the Japanese economy, which has been stagnating for 2 decades, the Japanese government has built roads to nowhere in search of these elusive positive multiplier effects. So this basically is a very, very unusual, crazy situation where infrastructure spending is going ahead to try and stimulate the demand side of the economy by looking for these multiplier effects. Okay, so I've asked the question here. So the marginal propensity to consume in Japan is 0.2. Calculate the final increase in Japanese GDP following a fiscal stimulus of 20 billion. So let's pause things there and see if you can calculate that. Okay, so hopefully you've looked back at your notes, or better still, you've remembered the formula for the multiplier, which is either 1 over the leakages, the marginal propensity to save, plus the marginal rate of tax, plus the marginal rate of importation. The other way of working it out is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So 1 minus 0.2 is 0.8, 1 over 0.8 is 1.25, so the value of the multiplier is 1.25. You then multiply that by the fiscal stimulus, which is 20 billion. So 20 billion times 1.25 gives you an increase in GDP of 25 billion. That's the correct answer, 25 billion. Infrastructure spending and international competitiveness. Infrastructure spending can increase the pace of innovation within an economy. If domestic firms supply new products with exciting new features and/or designs, the nation's non-price international competitiveness will improve. By increasing productivity, better infrastructure will reduce unit labour costs. As we've seen, lower costs will allow domestic firms to reduce their prices without losing profit margin. So that will improve international price competitiveness. Improved international competitiveness will increase export income and reduce import expenditure. As a result, the current account with the balance of payments will move towards surplus. So that means that the net exports, that's X minus M, the net exports component of aggregate demand will now make a more positive contribution to aggregate demand than it did before. So the increase in aggregate demand created by an improvement in international competitiveness will create, hopefully, short-run, export-led economic growth. This, of course, is assuming that there is a negative output gap to be closed. So why is export-led growth especially important for low and middle income developing countries? You can pause this for a sec. Think about the answer. Yeah, the answer is that in low income developing countries, domestic consumption's low. So if you want to diversify and start producing fridge freezers and HD TVs, you're going to need access to the rich export markets of the developed world, because domestic consumers in your part of the world don't earn enough to buy the high value added products that you would like to start making. So let's look at the potential drawbacks of infrastructure spending. So the first one is just the vast scale and huge costs of infrastructure spending. So yeah, these projects tend to be very, very expensive. So a huge amount of money might be required as upfront capital cost. So what's going to be the opportunity cost of this public spending? Obviously, this is in the news at the moment with HS2. I think it started out at about £30 billion budget, but nothing's really been done yet. But I think the last estimate that I saw was like £90 billion. So it's just that these are huge sums of money. So there are always opportunity costs involved in spending any money. But when you're spending huge amounts of money, obviously the opportunity costs that you're potentially missing out on are also they've also got to be considered. So to finance infrastructure spending the conventional way, which is the government doing it, the government will either have to raise taxes, cut government spending, so that might mean training fewer NHS doctors, or maybe not replacing state school teachers who retire, so you end up with bigger class sizes. Or the government could just do what it normally does, is just crank up the fiscal deficit. The problem with that is that it will accelerate the rate of growth of the national debt being the total amount that the government owes to its bondholders. The bigger the national debt, ceteris paribus, the more that the government has to spend on debt interest every year. If the government's spending more on debt interest, then there's even less money to spend on drugs for the NHS, computers for schools. So the quality of public services in the here and now tends to drop. High levels of public spending can crowd out the more efficient private sector, so GDP could fall. So, for example, running bigger fiscal deficits will reduce the availability of loanable funds for the private sector to borrow. So, as a result of that, the private sector investment falls. So, if you think about a finite amount of loanable funds, if the state is borrowing more loanable funds to finance its big fiscal deficits, then that must mean that there are fewer loanable funds available for private businesses to borrow. So if the state funds investment by running fiscal deficits, that will mean that there'll be fewer loanable funds for private businesses to borrow. So the opportunity cost of the state investing more is that there'll be less private sector investment. And this is the crowding out argument, that public sector investment crowds out private sector investment. And why is that a problem? Well, private companies have to make a profit to survive. Nationalised industries and public services like the NHS don't. So that requirement to make a profit arguably makes private enterprises more efficient. They'll be able to spend loanable funds more wisely on investment projects that make better sense than public sector investment projects, like HS2, for example. So we've also got the issue of government failure. This is again a flashback to a theme 1 topic. Government failure occurs when government intervention into the economy backfires. It leads to unintended consequences. So rather than government intervention increasing economic welfare, it actually does the opposite. It actually reduces the quality of life. So how can we apply the concept of government failure in this setting of public sector infrastructure? Well, I think the answer is, well, are we actually going to back central planners employed by the government to make good quality investment decisions. Like, what incentive do those central planners have to make good quality decisions? Because ultimately they're not playing with their own money, they're playing with taxpayers' money. So is it likely that they're going to make good decisions? I don't think it is. So as a result, some, you might say most of the infrastructure projects selected by the government might be wasteful, inappropriate, or just unnecessary. Again, there's a lot of publicity about HS2. It's often argued that World Bank loans that are made to developing governments are misspent. So you might get hydroelectric power stations or international airports being built in places like Nepal that are completely inappropriate for that country's current level of development. So the big issue there is that because those investments are inappropriate, they're not very likely to create much GDP growth. And if there's only minimal GDP growth, there won't be much extra tax income generated from the investment. And that's a problem because the government that borrowed the money from the World Bank will have to pay it back plus the interest owed. So to make that type of borrowing sustainable, there needs to be some decent extra tax incomes generated from some decent extra growth. But if the investment's inappropriate, there's no extra growth, no extra tax income. So it's really difficult then for those governments to pay the interest on their World Bank loans, let alone repaying any of the principal. So what that results in is the poor old taxpayer in those developing countries having to pick up the tab. You know, their tax rates go up because the government's expenditure has increased because they've got more interest to pay because they borrowed money from the World Bank to finance a non-performing investment. And I think the other thing that I've mentioned on the slide there is just the idea of information gaps. Does the state actually possess the information needed to make high quality decisions? And then public choice theory is also relevant. So according to public choice theory, politicians are also human too. And like me and you, they will pursue their self-interest. So from a politician's perspective, that might involve pushing lucrative public sector contracts by the way of cronies who, spooky coincidence, go on to employ the said politician once their political career has ended. Or maybe it's something more direct, you know, maybe they, in return for a lucrative contract, a big corporation pays a politician, I don't know, a bribe. Let's call it a party political donation or something.